Cool. So as Amber said, my name is Sam and I'm a third year PhD student from the University of Adelaide. And for the last few years of my PhD, I've been working on the Warumpi province, which has been a really exciting place to work. I got to visit there for the first time earlier this year, which was amazing. And it was initially meant to be quite a short-term project. It was meant to just be the first chapter of my PhD, but we found that these rocks were a lot more interesting and confusing than we originally anticipated. We found that accessory minerals that we typically rely on quite heavily weren't behaving quite in the way that we expected, and that garnets were potentially a really good way to fully understand the evolution of these rocks. So I'll be talking today about how these findings shape our understanding for the Proterozoic evolution of Central Australia. I've been working on this project alongside my supervisors, Martin Hand, Laura Morrissey and David Kelsey, and I've also been sponsored by the AIG, the GSA and the Playford Trust. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that my samples were collected from Luricha Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to those traditional owners. So the main points that I'll be touching on today are, well, I guess I could summarize all of them in one point, which is that polymetamorphic rocks are really, really confusing. The direct result of this polymetamorphism in the Warumpi province is that the bulk compositions of these rocks have been changed to the point where they don't really like to melt, which means that they don't like to recrystallize their accessory minerals, which means that we then have decoupled geochronology and pressure temperature constraints from those rocks. A way to, I guess, combat this is in polymetamorphic terrains, it's really important to try and directly date minerals that belong to that peak assemblage and are really good petrogenetic indicators like garnet, which is what we did in this study. As for how these results play out in the Warumpi province specifically, we found that high to ultra high temperature metamorphism actually occurred during the Musgrave orogeny, which is contrary to what we've previously thought, which is that it happened during the Liebig orogeny. So there's a 500 million year difference in those hypotheses, I suppose. The final point that I'll touch on today is that the Warumpi province could be a really good application of thermal buffering in the field. I'll explain that a little bit later in this slideshow, but it's something that we've seen theoretically in labs before, but it hasn't really been shown to work that well in the field until now. So we'll get to that eventually. So starting off with the Warumpi province, hopefully a few of you have heard of it, but if you haven't, it's a bit of a high temperature landmark along the southern margin of the North Australian Craton. It's primarily comprised of metasedimentary rocks, felsic gneiss and gabbro, and it's split into three major domains. And these are categorized based on different metamorphic facies. We've got the Yaya domain in the red, the Harsbluff in the orange, and the Kintor in the green. And the one that we care about is the extra hot one, so our Yaya domain, which is a granulite facies domain. And we tried to find the hottest rocks that we could in this location, which belonged to a hill that was once called Hill 830, but we've renamed the Yaya Hills because we thought it deserved to be more than just a little number. The Yaya Hills and the Warumpi province as a whole have been affected by two major events in their history. The first is the Liebig orogeny, which is a 1.6 billion year old event, and the second is the Musgrave orogeny, which occurred between 1200 to 1100 million years ago. So this is an aerial image of our Yaya Hills showing where I collected my samples. We've got a granulite facies Boudin here that I've outlined in red, where I've collected two high to ultra high temperature metapolitic samples, 6 and 7. A little bit further to the east, we have sample 20, which is a little bit lower temperature, but also metapolitic. And you'll notice as well that I've outlined these blue bodies on either side. They're big gabbro bodies. And I've collected one final sample, which is sample 23 from the northern extent of that, and that's a metamorphosed mafic sample. So I'm going to start by talking about samples 6 and 7. Which is how I started my PhD. We were trying to just confirm past findings from Scrimgeour, basically, about pressure temperature constraints and geochronology from that area. So we jumped straight to the high temperature rocks and had a look at the story that they were telling. So this is what they look like. This is our thin sections. This is sample 6 on the top, and sample 7, I've got two different thin sections, and I've got that on the bottom here. So sample 6 is primarily comprised of coarse-grained orthopyroxene interlaid with coarse-grained cordierite and fine-grained sillimanite, and a little bit of biotite around the place as well. We see minor amounts of garnet, and when we do see it, it has this sort of weird relationship with orthopyroxene. It's a bit like a symplectite, but it looks a little bit dodgy. We also see a lot of fine-grained minerals intergrowing with our cordierite. So along with the sillimanite that I mentioned in this one, we've also got fine-grained biotite, orthopyroxene, magnetite, and ilmenite. And we also see this fine-grained generation of orthopyroxene crystallizing around the margins of our primary orthopyroxene. Moving on to sample 7, this was a very confusing rock to work on. It's basically a giant symplectite, so it's just a big ball of chaos. But I'll show you a few of the textures that we see within this sample. So this is garnet here, our isotropic mineral, being separated from biotite, our high birefringence mineral, by a symplectic moat of cordierite, magnetite, and K feldspar. This is a similar texture again. This time biotite is being replaced by a corona of orthopyroxene, and then again we see a symplectite separating those minerals. We've got cordierite and orthopyroxene in the mix, separating them from garnet. And then this is how we know that these rocks are extra toasty. We've got fine-grained saffron intergrown with sillimanite within these samples. And the saffron's pretty low mode, but saffron only forms when temperatures are about 900 degrees. So that tells us that these rocks were once super, super hot. And finally, and something that I'll come back to, so remember this one, we have this coarse-grained garnet coronas growing around orthopyroxene, which is a pretty cool texture. Also of note, you can see here relic bedding within sample 6, which tells us that these samples are definitely metapelites. So in conclusion, you could summarize these samples as being magnesium, aluminium rich metapelites. They're high to ultra high temperatures. There's no real obvious evidence for melting in these samples. They're pretty dry and they're very complex texturally. So let's look at the geochronology that they have and the story that they're telling. This is our monazite results from samples 6 and 7. And I've said somewhat organized, but it's not really in the case of sample 7. It's pretty messy. But overall, they're dominated by this Paleoproterozoic age population. And previously, this has been linked to the high temperature collision of the Warumpi province with the North Australian craton. Zircon is very similar, a little bit more organized. It's dominated by this Paleoproterozoic age population again, with pretty much no record at all of our Musgrave orogeny. Previously, as I mentioned before, this has led us to link high temperature metamorphism with the Liebig orogeny. And it makes sense, right? We put zircon and monazite side by side here. They're what we previously considered to be some of the most reliable chronometers. They're existing in our high temperature rocks. The logical conclusion to draw is that something happened that was super high temperature 1.6 billion years ago. And that's also what we believed initially in this project. And then we started to look a little bit more closely at these minerals and at these rocks in general, and slightly different narratives began to emerge. Or you could say a series of red flags came out, I suppose. This is one of the first. So we had a look at zircon and garnet rare earth element partitioning. For those who may not look at this often, it's built on the idea that zircon and garnet tend to like heavy rare earth elements pretty much the same amount. So whichever one is there first keeps all of them to itself, and the other one will probably crystallize afterwards and not have much kept within that mineral. And if they crystallize at the same time, maybe they'll go 50-50. What we found here is that for zircon over garnet on the y-axis and our rare earth elements on the x-axis, where heavy rare earth elements on this side, pretty much all of our values are above 1, which means that zircon was keeping all of those rare earth elements to itself and garnet didn't really have any at all. We saw this in both sample 6 and sample 7. And this was a bit weird because we know that our zircon is Paleoproterozoic, and you would expect that if there was high temperature metamorphism going on, garnet would be a part of that equation and would probably be crystallizing at about the same time. The next thing we looked at were some pressure temperature models. So we took another look at our petrography, and we can cheat a little bit and overlay an MLA map. And we could see that minerals like garnet, cordierite, biotite, orthopyroxene, and ilmenite were super coarse grained, which probably means that they're peak minerals. And we also know that saffron was intergrown with sillimanite, and saffron is as hot as the minerals in this rock get. So that's likely to be part of the peak assemblage as well. And we had a look at our pressure temperature diagram, which is basically just a map of what minerals to expect at different pressures and temperatures for a certain bulk composition. And we found that saffron was coming in at the high temperature side of PT space, which is what you would expect. But what we didn't expect is that our orthopyroxene wasn't behaving in a way that we anticipated. So along with being able to map out what minerals exist in pressure temperature space, these diagrams also tell us what the compositions of those minerals should look like. And one that we commonly rely on is aluminium inside orthopyroxene. because aluminium is a really, really slow diffuser, so it shouldn't be diffusing out over time, and it should remain a pretty reliable indicator of peak conditions in that rock. What we were seeing is that for our measured aluminium contents between 4 and 7 weight percent, there's not really any crossover at all with our saffron bearing fields. So that's not what you would usually anticipate. We were hoping to see them crossing over about here. We saw the exact same thing in sample 6 as well. Yes, same thing again, where our aluminium contents were drastically lower than high to ultra high temperature metamorphism would be in these rocks. So that's probably the second major red flag that we saw in these samples. This prompted us to take a better look at our petrography, and the main thing, or the most important finding, is that garnet seems to replace orthopyroxene. It's forming these really coarse grained coronas, which we initially didn't notice because they're so large scale that it's hard to pick up on, I guess. And then sample 6 was also exhibiting this to a somewhat lesser degree, but still very much prevalent. We also see it at a hand sample scale as well, where that garnet is growing around orthopyroxene. Similarly, saffron and sillimanite, which we know are part of our high temperature assemblage, they're not very coarse grained. Usually we expect peak minerals to be growing a lot and therefore get super coarse grained, but they stayed pretty fine grained, which suggested that maybe they were part of a later metamorphic event. So based on this, we were thinking maybe we had 2 distinct phases of metamorphism preserved within these rocks, which is why they looked so complicated. So we think our first phase is comprised of orthopyroxene, cordierite, quartz, biotite, and then depending on which sample you looked at, ilmenite, magnetite, K-feldspar, and I've forgotten to mention plagioclase. And then our second phase is comprised of our coarse-grained garnet coronas, sillimanite, ilmenite, our saffron in sample 7, and then magnetite and K-feldspar, and a second generation of orthopyroxene, which you can see crystallizing around the primary generation, as well as cordierite and biotite. So that's all well and good, but what do those events actually look like? So we had a better look at our PT diagrams with those findings in mind. We found this peak assemblage occurs at about 3 to 4 kilobars and 820 to 860 degrees. So it's still a pretty high temperature event, but it's lower temperature than our saffron bearing assemblage would have experienced. And we think that it's about 3 to 4 kilobars, which is a lot lower in pressure than the second event was. We then modelled little subdomains of these rocks that were representative of that second phase of metamorphism, and we found that they were experiencing conditions of about 9 kilobars and 750 to 900 degrees. That's the results from both of those diagrams there. So again, that's great, but when did this actually happen? We know there's 2 events, but when did it occur? At this point, we decided to go straight to the source and have a look at our garnets. So as I mentioned at the start, when we were looking at our zircon garnet rare earth element partitioning, all of our rare earth elements, including lutetium, are trapped inside our zircon. So there's not a whole heap to work with the garnet, but we went for what I've tactfully called a utilitarian approach, but could also be called a brute force approach with this sample. And we analysed as much as we could of the garnet, a total of 429 spots. And that gave us an age of 1135 million years. It's definitely not it's not the best way to go about it, but it gave us an answer, and combined with everything else that we found in these rocks, I think it tells a pretty convincing tale. So that was our 4th and final red flag, I suppose, within these granulites. So to summarize those red flags that we've come across, we've got rare earth element partitioning that shows our 1.6 billion year old zircon existed before the garnet in the rock. Measured aluminium and orthopyroxene concentrations don't overlap at all with saffron bearing PT space. We've got garnet forming these coarse grained coronas around orthopyroxene, and finally we worked out how old that garnet is as well, and found that it was 1135 and therefore correlated with the Musgrave orogeny. So based on this, we think that high temperature metamorphism was actually a Musgrave feature rather than a Liebig feature, which means it's 500 million years younger than what everyone has thought for a long time. But why weren't our accessory minerals capable of recording this event and telling us this earlier on, I suppose? We think the answer lies in melting. So while we were looking at our high temperature granulites, 6 and 7, we were also looking at samples 20 and 23, which are both migmatitic samples. These are leucosomes in both of those. This is sample 20 and this is sample 23. And accessory minerals really, really like melt. That's the best way for them to crystallize. And we think that these rocks, I'll tell you about it in a second, but these rocks have much better records of the Musgrave orogeny within their accessory minerals. And we think that that's directly tied to their ability to form these beautiful melt structures. So looking at these migmatitic rocks, this is sample 23 on the left and sample 20 on the right. We've got coarse grain hornblende growing all through sample 23. We've got this big garnet in the middle. I don't know why I've created an inset when it's bigger on the main figure, but we'll continue. And then in sample 20, we've got these leucocratic lenses of quartz and plagioclase. We've also got garnets, so the chock-a-block with lots of inclusions like staurolite, quartz, sillimanite, biotite, and kyanite. So these rocks are also high temperature, but they're migmatitic and they're a lot more simple texturally than samples 6 and 7 were. We started off by looking at some zircon, which initially looked quite confusing because we do still have that Paleoproterozoic signature preserved within these samples. We do also see significant lead resetting towards our Musgrave orogeny, so we do preserve that signature within these rocks, at least compared to sample 6 and 7 where you didn't really see it at all. And I'll talk more about why we do still see that Paleoproterozoic population in a few slides' time. Comparatively, in our titanite and monazite geochronology from samples 23 and 20, we only see the Musgrave orogeny. So titanite gave us an age of 1125 plus minus 8 million years, and our monazite from sample 20 is mainly 1150 with only a few scattered ages that are a bit older. So yeah, our accessory minerals were definitely responsive to the Musgrave orogeny. We did the same thing as before and had a look at our garnet as well and got an analogous age of 1164 plus minus 36 million years, which overlaps really nicely with sample 6 as well. We then wanted to make sure that these rocks were actually experiencing the same events as our high temperature granulites. So we made some more pressure temperature models, and we found that our peak conditions are about 7 to 11 kilobars and 725 to 850 degrees, which is about the same as those high temperature granulites are. So with all of this in mind, what is actually going on? A whole lot is the answer. There's a lot going on. But if I was to talk about the Liebig orogeny specifically, I would say that it is a 1640 to 1630 million-year-old event, but it's not the high to ultra high temperature metamorphic event that it's previously been ascribed as. Instead, it's about 3 to 4 kilobars, and it's still high temperature, but it's 820 to 860 degrees. As for what was going on during this time, this is a map from Scrimgeour in 2013, and all these shades of pink and purple represent granitoids that have intruded during the Liebig orogeny. And we think that this is what characterizes the Liebig orogeny the best. We think there was a whole heap of magmatism going on. If we take another look at my sample location here, you can see outlined in the blue, we've got that big gabbro body, which we would expect to be part of that magmatism during the Liebig. Looking back at our zircon dates again, that would explain why sample 23 does still preserve some Liebig orogeny dates, because that's when it was intruded. And sample 20 may have either been an S-type granite or potentially just received a whole heap of detritus associated with this magmatism. Meanwhile, samples 6 and 7 are right next to this big gabbro body. So they would have been directly within that contact aureole. And we think that something happened during that high temperature, during the heat they received from that gabbro. And it affected their bulk compositions in a way that they became really, really refractory, and you could call them petrologically preconditioned. So these rocks, they're super dry, as I said before. There's no real evidence for melting, and accessory minerals really, really want melt for them to be able to recrystallize. So without that, we think that they effectively became locked in time and unable to update their geochronological record. As you can see here with samples 6 and 7 for zircon and monazite, where most dates were that Paleoproterozoic age. As for the Musgrave orogeny, it happened between 1200 to 1100 million years ago. It was about 9 kilobars and 750 to 900 degrees. So we think that that was a high temperature to ultra high temperature event. And as I mentioned before, samples 6 and 7 effectively became preconditioned and quite refractory, which meant that their accessory minerals remained inert during the subsequent Musgrave orogeny. Meanwhile, samples 20 and 23 melted and were able to recrystallize their accessory minerals and preserve a meaningful geochronological record of that Musgrave orogeny. Regardless, fertile or refractory, garnet is able to preserve the Musgrave orogeny in both sample types, in both our high temperature granulites and in our migmatites. So it was the ultimate truth teller, I suppose. So I've talked a little bit about the impact of melt on accessory mineral crystallization, but we think that it also affected these samples when it comes to measuring their temperatures. So the pressures for all four of these rocks are analogous. They're about 9 kilobars. They all overlap around there. But there is about a 70-degree temperature offset between our high temperature granulites and our migmatitic samples. And we think that this is due to a process called thermal buffering, where melting is an endothermic reaction, which means that it consumes energy. So if you've got energy coming into the system and the rocks are melting, maybe it's translating that energy into that melt process rather than into heat rise, which is what you would see in sample 6 and 7, which weren't losing out any of that energy through melting. We actually did some maths behind the scenes and worked out that sample 20 would need about 15% more energy in its system to experience the same high to ultra high temperatures as sample 6 and 7 did. And this has been shown theoretically before, but it's one of the first times we've had the rocks behave really well in the field and exhibit this phenomenon, I suppose. So in conclusion, my PhD has been a headache. No, it's been really fun, but polymetamorphism can make rocks have really, really complicated stories, and they might not actually tell those stories all that well, depending on which minerals you're looking at. In the case of the Warumpi province in Central Australia, we've seen geochronology and pressure temperature constraints become really decoupled, which has affected how we've understood what Australia was doing during the Proterozoic. As a way to remedy this, I think in polymetamorphic terrains, it's really important to both use conventional geochronology, but also supplement it by directly dating minerals that we know are part of that peak assemblage. So, for example, lutetium, hafnium in garnet. In the Warumpi province, we think that ultra-high temperature metamorphism was a Musgrave feature rather than a Liebig feature, which shifts the narrative by about 500 million years. And last but not least, the Warumpi province is a really good natural laboratory for understanding thermal buffering. And that is all from me. Thank you.